to beyoungministry.blogspot.com, to another podcast and another blog. Thank you to those who access the podcast through the Be Young Ministry page on YouTube. Today we transition into John chapter 4, and we'll consider verses 1 through 6, which read, "Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon." That's John chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. As pointed out before, among many other themes in this gospel, according to John, is the fullness of the Lord Jesus Christ. He lacks nothing. Contrasted in today's text is the emptiness of mankind. I point you back to John chapter 1, verse 14, which reads, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." As we transition into John chapter 4, we see this contrast demonstrated in the life of the woman at the well. But before we consider this true story, we consider the first 6 verses of the chapter. According to verses 1 through 3, the Lord Jesus leaves Judea because the Pharisees had heard of the growing popularity of the Lord Jesus. This story illustrates why we suffer from emptiness. To date, the Pharisees had been given some evidence that the Lord Jesus was the promised Messiah. Even one of their own went to the Lord Jesus with questions. Yet, at this point, they are not choosing to believe in the Lord Jesus as their Messiah. There's an important principle here that I must highlight. When God gives us revelation and we reject it, our hearts and our understanding of what is real will become more dull. It's just the nature of what happens to us when we reject the truth. Rejecting God's truth is a dangerous thing, as is eventually demonstrated among these religious leaders. The rejection of truth seals their bondage to the lie of the evil one. This lie says you can determine what truth is for yourself. This lie is embraced when we deny God's brilliance in our lives. When we deny God's definition of things, we will be defined by something else. Most often we are that something else, and due to our fallen nature, we do not choose wisely. We gain insight from a story in the Old Testament. After the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant in battle, they took the ark into the temple of their god, Dagon. Initially, Dagon was found on his face in front of the ark. And what did the Philistines do? They ignored the evidence and put Dagon back on his pedestal in front of the ark. The next day, Dagon is found on his face in front of the ark. But this time, his hands and head were broken off. What did the people do? They again ignored the evidence and made the spot where the broken hands and head of Dagon were found a holy place. Then the people developed tumors, which they could not ignore, so they called a council to try and decide what to do. The following is the discussion that takes place in 1 Samuel chapter 6. The Philistines asked, "What guilt offering should we send to them?" They replied, 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, according to the number of the Philistine rulers, because the same plague has struck you both and your rulers. Make models of the tumors and of the rats that are destroying the country, and pay honor to Israel's God. Perhaps he will lift his hand from you and your gods and your land. Why do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did? When he treated them harshly, did they not send the Israelites out so they could go their own way? That comes from 1 Samuel 6, verses 4 through 6. A lot of people want to say God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but long before God hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his own heart, illustrating the point that I'm making. It's a dangerous thing to say no to truth. I think it explains the following story that we'll go into more depth tomorrow with this woman at the well. But back to chapter 4 of John. In verse 4, John informs us that the Lord Jesus needed to go through Samaria. Samaria is the land between Judea and Galilee. This direct route from Judea to Galilee was about 70 miles, or a 2.5-day walk. But many of the Jews chose not to go through Samaria. They traveled the hot desert road from Jerusalem to Jericho and up the Jordan Valley. Thus, because of the terrible prejudice that prevailed against the Samaritan people, the Jews journeyed almost twice the distance on a much hotter and more uncomfortable road. The Lord Jesus cuts right through that ignorant, narrow-minded prejudice and went through Samaria. He needed to go through Samaria. In verse 5, John tells us of the place where Jesus stopped, Jacob's well, at the foot of Mount Gerizim. The Israelites were commanded in the Old Testament to read the law of Moses every year from the tops of the twin mountains that span the valley that leads up to the city of Samaria. Mount Gerizim on the east and Mount Ebal on the west. Mount Gerizim was the place where the blessings of the law were read, while Mount Ebal was where the curses of the law were read to those who disobeyed it. There, about a half-mile west of the village of Sychar, where Joseph's tomb is, at the well which Jacob in his day had dug for his flocks and herds, Jesus sat down to rest. It was noon when Jesus stopped at the well. As we will highlight tomorrow, the lady the Lord Jesus meets here was empty. She had not come to get water early in the morning like the other ladies in the city. No, she came in the middle of the day, probably to avoid the women who probably spoke in condemning words and tones due to the fact that she was considered by them as a less than. She was a less than because she allowed someone much lesser than the one known as the truth to define her. The same is true for us. When we allow something less than God, the perfect one, to define us, we're going to be lesser than. And if we live out of an identity based on how God sees us, we will no longer feel the need to find our worth in the lesser things of life. We will be freed to live in a confident and in a secure manner because the perfect one will be our definer. And as we experience life from the acceptance through His unconditional love, we will live confidently and boldly because we are being defined by Him rather than the lesser. My friends, if I can be of further help to you, shoot me an email at beyoungministry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.